The cowboy accepted an Apache slave as payment, only to discover that she was the chief's daughter. But before we dive into the story, don't forget to like the video and tell us in the comments where you're watching from. Wade Carrick had spent the last 12 years living alone on a plot of arid land outside Broken Mesa. He had worked as a trail scout for army convoys and cattle outfits until a caravan raid ended with his younger brother being shot in the ribs, while Wade was unfortunately too far ahead to help. After burying his brother, Wade stopped taking contracts. He built a cabin with leftover lumber and scrap nails and worked just enough cattle to stay alive. His only goal was to avoid other people and the trouble they dragged with them. He had no wife, family or crew, just the land, 2 horses and a rifle that he rarely used, unless a coyote came too close to the chicken pen. One evening he had just filled a tin pail with water from the well and was scraping mud off his boots when he heard the sound of horses approaching from the south trail. The sound of hooves on hard dirt depends on how fast the riders are going, and these weren't moving with focus or discipline. The rhythm was unsteady, drunk, tired, or both. He stopped what he was doing and watched the line of riders approach. He considered going inside for the rifle, but knew that stepping outside with a gun in hand would only stir things up. 3 riders emerged from the dust. Their clothes were stained with sweat and trail dirt, and their faces were unshaven. One wore a cavalry coat with no insignia, another had a scar over his eyebrow, and the third smelled of whiskey even from a distance. Their horses were breathing hard and were flecked with foam. WDE remained near the fence, his expression impassive. He didn't greet them or ask questions. People who arrived uninvited usually came with excuses or demands. The man at the front raised a hand as if they were neighbors. "Evening. We've come to trade," he said. His voice was rough, as if it had been strained from shouting earlier. Wade didn't answer. His silence prompted the man to continue talking. "We were told that the mayor of this bay would be ours in exchange for our work last spring. We're here to collect." His eyes were bloodshot, and his speech was slurred, not just from fatigue. Wade's jaw moved once. "I don't owe you a thing," he said in a steady voice, not raising it. The man jerked his chin towards the rider in the back. "Got payment with you?" It was then that Wade noticed the rope trailing from the saddle horn. A woman was walking behind the horse, her wrists bound in front, and the rope tight enough to leave angry red grooves. Her ankles were scraped. She was barefoot. With every step she took, her legs seemed to give way beneath her, but she forced them to stand straight again. Her long black hair was stuck to the side of her face with dirt and sweat. The deerskin dress she was wearing had been ripped down the side and across the chest, exposing the top of one breast and the bruises on her collarbone. They stopped a few yards from the fence. The rider yanked the rope forward, causing her to stumble, but she didn't cry out. She kept her head down, and her breathing was uneven and shallow. The lead man grinned. "Caught her stealing near the canyon. The army don't want her. We're leaving her here. You get the horse and we'll get the mare. Nobody argues." Wade looked at the woman, then at the men. His face remained impassive, but his stomach tightened. He knew what they wanted. It was an easy trade, no questions asked. He also knew what would happen if he refused. 3 half-sober men with guns, short tempers, and nothing to lose could cause more damage than they could ever hope to gain. "I don't trade people," he said. "You ain't trading. You're receiving. Take the horse. She'll stay here until someone comes for her." The man's tone made it clear that they wouldn't wait for an answer. Wade didn't like giving ground, but he assessed the risk. He had no backup and no nearby neighbors, and a gunfight in the open would be loud and pointless. Without showing any emotion, he nodded once towards the corral. "Take the mare and ride." They didn't thank him. 2 men dismounted and untied the horse he had pointed out. The third tied the woman to the fence post, as though she were luggage being dropped off. She braced herself and took the impact without falling. When they mounted up again, one of the men chuckled. "If she dies here, you can bury her or leave her for the wolves. It's your problem now." They rode off, leaving a trail of dust behind them. When the riders had disappeared, Wade stood still for almost a full minute. He could hear the faint rasp of the woman's breath, the wind rustling the dry undergrowth, and the creak of the fence rope. He didn't go near her. Instead, he walked back towards the cabin as if nothing had happened. Inside, he took off his hat and sat down. He poured himself a glass of water and drank half of it. He told himself that she was not his responsibility. Fort Haven riders crossed this land twice a week. They would either see her and take her, or they wouldn't. Either way, it wasn't his responsibility. As darkness fell, he lit a lamp and sliced some salted pork. He ate slowly, thinking about the last time he had ignored something that didn't belong to him. That memory always ended with a grave, and a man whose blood was on WDE's hands. He glanced through the doorway again. She was still standing, but her shoulders were slumped. The night air was cooling and she had no shoes or fire. Nothing but rope was holding her up. She hadn't made a sound. An hour passed. Coyotes began to howl. He tried to lie down, but couldn't. He sat up on the edge of the bed and felt a sour pull in his chest. He wasn't sure whether it was annoyance or guilt. He swore under his breath and stood up. Outside, the air was cooler. He walked to her without speaking. She didn't notice him until he touched the rope. She tensed, but didn't resist. Her skin was hot with fever when his hand brushed her arm. He saw the cracked heels of her feet, the trembling of her legs, and the hardened rope, burns covered in dried blood. He cut the rope with his knife. Her arms dropped forward and she swayed. He grabbed her before she hit the ground. She weighed less than he expected. She was all tension and bone, covered in sweat and dirt. She didn't try to talk or ask questions. Her eyes were half open but unfocused. "I'm not keeping you," he said quietly, more to force the decision to be temporary. He picked her up and carried her inside. Her head rested against his chest, and her hair stuck to his shirt. Her torn dress slipped, but he didn't look. He laid her on the spare cot that his brother had once used and pulled a blanket over her. In the dim light of the lamppost, he could see the bruises on her ribs and shoulder, the cut on her thigh and the swelling on her wrists. She was breathing the way people do when their body's trying to shut down while still functioning. He fetched a tin cup of water and placed it near the bed. He considered asking her name, but she was already unconscious. Wade sat down in the chair again and stared at the floor. He told himself that she would leave as soon as she could walk. He wouldn't get involved. He wouldn't ask who she was. He wouldn't let this become another burden that cost more than it gave. But he didn't lie down. He stayed awake and listened to make sure she was still breathing. The night remained quiet, only disturbed by the wind against the wood and the sound of someone he didn't intend to rescue, fighting to stay alive in his bed. Wade woke before sunrise, as he did every morning, but the quiet in the cabin felt different. For a moment, he forgot she was there. Then he heard the shallow, rasping breaths coming from the cot and remembered that he had carried an unconscious Apache woman into his home after dark. He sat up on the edge of the bed, rubbed the back of his neck and listened. She hadn't moved much. The blanket still covered her shoulders, and one bruised and swollen arm lay outside it, the swelling at the wrist caused by the rope cutting in. He stood up and crossed the room. Questions turned in his mind that he didn't voice. Where had those men taken her from? Was anyone searching for her? Had the army already marked her as their property, or a prisoner? If he rode into town and someone recognized her, they would assume that he had stolen or bought her, and neither accusation would end well. Up close, he could see dirt caked at her hairline and dry blood on her leg, where her dress had split above the thigh. He checked the cut. It wasn't deep, but it was filthy. Her feet were cracked and swollen, the soles dark with bruising and torn skin. No one could walk in that condition for long unless they were forced to. He stepped back, fetched the old wash basin from the corner, and filled it with water from the pail. He set it near the cot. She didn't open her eyes, but her breathing caught when the cold cloth touched her forehead. He cleaned the dirt from her face and wiped her hands, being careful not to press too hard where the rope burns were still raw and glistening. She stirred once, her lips parting. She tried to speak, but no words formed. He gave her a sip of water, holding the cup steady to her mouth. Most of it ran down her chin, but she swallowed enough to stop herself from choking. He didn't try to talk to her or ask if she could understand him. He focused on practical matters first. There was a cabinet by the door where he kept dried bread, coffee and jerky. He sliced a piece of bread into small chunks and put them in a tin bowl in case she woke up feeling hungry. Having stitched his own cuts and patched men on the trail after ambushes dozens of times, tending her wounds didn't feel strange, only inconvenient. While she rested, he stepped outside to tend to the animals. The bay mare that those men had taken had been one of his better horses. and the loss stung more now that the sun had risen and it felt real. The chicken pen was quiet, and a thin layer of dust had coated the water trough again. He checked the horizon out of habit. There were no riders in sight, no army patrol, and no wagon tracks. The land was still, but this never lasted long. When he returned inside, she was half awake, her eyes barely open. She looked at the ceiling first, then shifted her gaze towards him. There was no panic on her face, only exhaustion and caution, the kind that animals have after being hunted for too long. Her throat moved as if she wanted to speak. He crouched beside the cot. "You can drink if you're able," he said in a low, even voice. She blinked, understanding the intention, even if not the words. She raised one hand weakly, trying to pull the blanket up over her chest. Her torn dress still sagged at the neckline, exposing bruised skin near her collarbone and the top curve of one breast. She avoided his gaze as she covered up. He stood up and brought the bowl of bread, setting it on the floor beside her. "You eat when you can, then you leave when you're able to walk." He spoke as though he was making a contract with himself as well as with her. She looked at him then, her dark eyes steady and not pleading. She tried to speak again, her voice little more than a whisper. "No go," she said slowly, her words rough but clear enough. She wasn't asking for permission, she was stating her refusal. He didn't answer. He wasn't ready to argue with someone who couldn't even stand up straight. Instead, he reached for an old shirt in a trunk. It was one of his lighter ones, still worn-looking, but clean. He placed it at the foot of the cot. "The dress is torn. Use that when you can stand." Her gaze followed his hand, but she said nothing. She closed her eyes again for a moment, as if looking cost her too much strength. There was a question hanging in the air. What was her name? Who was she? Why had those men taken her? But he didn't ask yet. It wasn't because he didn't want to know. It was because knowing would make her his problem, and he'd spent years making sure he had none. An hour passed before she tried to sit up. He watched from the table with his arms crossed, ready to help her if she fell, but not rushing to do so. She managed to brace herself on one elbow and pull the blanket around her. The movement made her flinch where the rope burn stretched. She looked at the tin bowl, then at him, deciding whether it was safe to accept food from him. Her hunger disappeared. She reached out slowly, her fingers trembling, and brought a piece of bread to her mouth. He watched her chew carefully, as though swallowing too much might make her sick. After finishing the second piece, she spoke again in a quiet voice, struggling with her limited English. "Name?" He hadn't expected her to ask first. He hesitated, not out of fear, but because names made things real. "Wade," he said finally. She nodded once. He waited, thinking she might offer hers. When she didn't, he forced himself to ask, "What do I call you?" She looked at the floor, then at the wall, avoiding his gaze as she answered, "Ayana." The name landed differently than he expected. It seemed less like that of a passing stranger, and more like that of someone whose absence might be noticed elsewhere. This made his next thought heavier. If someone was looking for her, coming here could lead them straight to his door. He said nothing about it, not yet. She finished the last piece of bread and leaned back slowly, her eyelids lowered but not fully closed. The fever had dropped slightly, but she was still weak. He took the empty bowl and stood near the door for a moment. "You rest now," he said. "When you can walk, you can go." She didn't nod or argue. She looked at him with the same unreadable expression she'd had when he cut the rope. Neither trust nor fear, just quiet endurance. He stepped outside again, telling himself that this was temporary and that she would not stay. He told himself that he would not let another life become tied to his. But even as the sun climbed higher and the heat returned to the yard, he kept listening for any sound from the cot. Every time he checked the horizon, he wasn't sure whether he was hoping to see riders or praying not to. Throughout the late morning, the cabin remained quiet, except for the occasional creak of wood as the wind blew against the walls. Wade split firewood near the shed, listening without meaning to. He told himself he was only making sure she didn't faint or choke. But the truth was harder to ignore now that he had spoken her name in his mind. Ayana. He had seen Apache women before, in passing. He'd traded with some and fought against others, but he'd never had one lying in his bed or asking his name. When he stepped back inside, she was awake again, sitting upright with the blanket wrapped tightly around her shoulders. Dirt streaked her arms and legs, and her hair hung down in a heavy tangle. She had pulled his shirt into her lap, but hadn't put it on yet. She seemed to be studying the cabin piece by piece. First the stove with its blackened pipe, then the narrow table and the single shelf with 2 tin plates and a coffee pot. Her eyes moved slowly. They swept over each item once, as though she was committing it to memory. He filled a cup from the basin and handed it to her without touching her. She took it, her fingers still unsteady but stronger than before, and drank slowly. He watched the way she handled the water, controlled and careful, like someone who had learned not to drink too quickly or waste anything. She didn't look at him when she spoke. "Why did you take me inside?" He didn't answer right away. The question was direct and not wounded. Her voice was rough but steady. He leaned his shoulder against the wall and crossed his arms. "You would have died out there if I hadn't." That was the simplest version of the truth. He didn't want another memory to turn into a grave. He kept to himself. Ayana lowered the cup. "Men say you took me as a trade." "I didn't ask for you," he said flatly. "I didn't want to fight over a damn horse." He didn't care if his words were blunt. Honesty was the only thing he had left some days. She nodded once, absorbing that information without showing any visible reaction. Then she pointed to her torn and swollen wrists. They took 3 days. No food, no speaking my name. Her English was broken, but her meaning was clear. He crouched beside the bed and examined the rope burns. Infection was a risk. He got the thick, herbal-smelling salve he kept for injuries and set it beside her. "For the wrist," he said. She didn't reach for it. She waited until he stepped back, then uncapped the tin and slowly began to apply the salve herself, wincing when it stung her raw skin. He stayed close enough to intervene if necessary, but only moved to help if she dropped something. When she had finished, he placed a strip of cloth on the edge of the bed. "Wrap them. Keep them clean." She tied each wrist with the fabric, gripping the ends between her teeth when her fingers shook too much. When she had finished, she picked up the shirt he had given her. "Turn around," she said quietly, motioning with her chin. He didn't argue. He turned his back to her and stared at the window while she pulled the torn dress down from one shoulder and pulled the shirt over her head. He heard the fabric catch on her hair, followed by her quiet breath as she tugged it into place. When she was finished, he faced her again. His shirt hung past her thighs and the sleeves were rolled past her elbows. She kept the blanket over her legs. The dress lay bunched on the floor, thick with blood and dirt in the seams. He wondered how long she had been wearing it and how many times she had been dragged or knocked down before it tore. He brought her a small plate with some jerky and half an apple that he had been saving. She ate the jerky first, taking small bites and chewing each one slowly. Then she hesitated over the apple, before finally taking it. As she bit into it, her shoulders relaxed slightly, as though the taste of something clean had stirred a memory. He finally asked the question that had been on his mind since the night before. "You got people looking for you?" For the first time since he'd seen her awake, she looked directly at him. Her eyes didn't flicker or shift. Maybe dead. She paused, searching for the right words in English. "Raid soldiers. I hide in the rocks. Men took me when I went out for water." Her tone didn't waver. She spoke as though she were remembering the weather, not pain. He absorbed the details without showing any frustration, even though they made things more complicated than he wanted. If the soldiers had attacked her group and the bounty riders had taken her, someone might be tracking either group. He looked towards the door instinctively, gauging the distance to his rifle. "You stay until you can stand and ride," he said. "Then you can go wherever you're going." She placed the apple core on the plate and looked around again. "I'll go with no shoes and no horse." She wasn't pleading, she was stating a fact. Her feet were still cracked and swollen. Even if he forced her off his land, she wouldn't get far. He didn't respond, not because he hadn't heard her, but because saying anything would force him to make a decision he wasn't ready for. At midday, the heat thickened through the cabin. He moved the basin to the table and cleaned his hands. She lay back down slowly. The energy she had used up was burning out quickly. The fever hadn't returned fully yet, but she was still weak. He covered her legs with the blanket again. Before he stepped back outside, she spoke once more. "You'll leave me when I can walk?" "Yeah," he said. She didn't look relieved or angry. She just nodded and closed her eyes, as if accepting a fate she had already anticipated. He stood there for a moment longer, then went to check the shed by the fence. He didn't see any tracks near the ridge. There were no smoke signals, no glint of metal, and no riders cutting across the flats. Still, his gut remained tense. By late afternoon, he had mended a broken hinge on the chicken pen and checked the water barrel twice. He kept glancing at the horizon and the cabin door, telling himself that he was just being cautious. But the question had already settled at the back of his mind. If someone came looking for her, tribe, army, or bounty hunters, would he hand her over? Or would he fight to keep something he never intended to take? By the time the sun had slipped towards late afternoon, Wade had completed most of the chores he would normally spread across the day. Work usually helped him to push thoughts aside, but now every task left room for distraction. He checked the corral fence twice, even though he knew there were no other horses left in it. He poured feed for the chickens, even though they were still pecking at scraps from that morning. He sharpened a hatchet that wasn't dull. With each step, he approached the cabin door again, but each time he stopped himself from going in too soon. When he finally opened the door, she was sitting up again with her legs covered by the blanket and his shirt hanging loosely around her. She had tried to braid part of her hair, but it was tangled and stuck to dried blood in places. There was a pile of dirt that she had scraped from under her nails onto the floorboard near the cot. She looked alert and weak, but no longer on the verge of collapse. He placed a tin cup containing water, as well as a portion of reheated cooked beans and some salt pork, on the floor. She didn't reach for it right away. Her eyes drifted to the open door behind him, then back to the cup. "Are the men back?" she asked. "Not those men," he replied. "They got what they wanted." She took that in, then lifted the cup with both hands. Despite being wrapped, her wrists still trembled. She drank slowly, then nodded at the plate once. That was the closest she came to asking permission to eat. He pulled a chair up to the table, sat down and watched her without staring. Her chest rose slowly as she chewed. He could see bruises on the back of her neck, where someone had probably pushed or grabbed her. The collar of her shirt hid some of them, but they were fresh. There were still questions she hadn't answered. How many men were involved? Had anyone else been taken? How far from here had she been captured? But he didn't push. Instead, he asked something simpler. "How far was your band from the canyon when the raid happened?" She hesitated, not because she didn't understand, but because she was deciding whether to answer. 2 days' walk north of Water Pass, she said. The soldiers came late. Fire, many run. He nodded once. He knew the area she meant. There were rough ridges, dead junipers, and a dry stream bed that sometimes held pools of water after storms. If soldiers had attacked there might be scattered bodies or prisoners. News of that kind made its way to town slowly and was distorted by rumor. Broken Mesa rarely heard the truth first. He didn't ask if she had a husband, children, or family among those who had scattered, but something in her face made him think she had lost more than her freedom in the past week. She set the empty plate aside and wiped her mouth with the back of her hand. Her breathing steadied. After a few seconds of silence, she spoke again. "You've lived here alone for a long time." 12 years, he said. "Since the raids up near Salt Creek took half the trail crew I worked with." He didn't mention his brother. He almost never did. She studied him as though weighing up that answer. Then she looked at the door again. "You fight if they come, or you send me out." He didn't move in his chair, but his eyes fixed on hers. The question wasn't angry. It was direct, in the same way that a person might ask if a roof leaks, or if a horse bites. "It depends who rides in," he said truthfully, clearing his throat. She nodded once, neither disappointed nor relieved. She understood more than she spoke. The silence after her words brought up something else he'd been avoiding. What if her people survived and came looking for her? He knew some Apache bands were good at tracking and traveling quietly. If any scouts were searching, they might already be following the riders who took her. His cabin wasn't far from a route used by hunters and raiding parties in dry years. He checked the window out of habit. She noticed. "If my people find you, they'll kill you," she said maliciously. "They think you took me to use or trade me." He didn't flinch. "Then you tell them differently." She looked down at her bound wrists. They didn't always listen to women first. The truth of that hung heavily in the air. He'd seen it before. He'd seen the way some tribal men treated captured women, and how suspicion could cut deeper than fact. He stood up and took the empty dishes to the basin. "You're not a slave here," he said. "If anyone rides in, they'll hear that from me first." She watched him. trying to read whether he meant it or if he just wanted peace until she could walk away. "Why?" she asked. He dried the bowl with an old cloth. "Because I don't want another grave near this cabin," he replied. He didn't add any more details. He didn't know her history, but part of it had slipped through anyway. She didn't respond, but her gaze shifted from caution to something quieter, not trust, but not complete distrust either. As the light faded, he fetched his spare boots and placed them at the foot of the bed. "They won't fit perfectly, but they're better than walking barefoot." She touched the worn leather and nodded once. "When I'm strong, I'll go," she said, reminding him of the plan he'd made. He should have agreed and left it at that. Instead, he found himself saying, "You can't go far alone." Not with soldiers and riders still circling the valleys. Her brow tightened slightly. "You're sending me to town?" "No," he replied immediately. "Town is the worst place. Questions, stares, and unwanted hands." He realized that she thought he might hand her over or trade her back. "You can stay here until you decide where to go. I won't force you out." She took that in without showing any visible relief or resistance. Before she closed her eyes, she asked one more thing. "If my people come first, you speak before they kill." He met her gaze. "I don't run from a door I open," he said. She blinked once, then rested her head against the cot. For the first time since her arrival, she fell asleep without collapsing into it. WDE sat at the table until the lamplight burned low, turning over what he had just promised. He didn't know her story fully, nor did he know who might be hunting her or what blood oath trailed behind her name. All he knew was that the moment he cut that rope, her problems crossed into his territory, and now he would have to decide which ones to face with words and which with a rifle. Morning came without noise. Wade woke to the faint sound of movement near the cot. Ayana was sitting upright again, one hand pressed against her side as if a bruise there had stiffened overnight. The blanket had slipped down to her waist, and his loose-fitting shirt clung to her shoulders with dried sweat. She noticed him watching and pulled the blanket back up, not out of embarrassment, but out of habit. Covering herself had become a reflex after being treated like property and paraded around. He didn't speak at first. Instead, he moved to the stove, stoked the coals, and poured water into a coffee pot. She shifted her legs over the side of the cot and eased her feet to the floor. The cuts on her soles had scabbed over overnight, though the cracks were still visible. She reached for the boots he had left her and tried them on while sitting down. They were too big and stiff, but she didn't complain. He watched her attempt to stand, steadying herself with one hand on the cot frame. She swayed, but didn't fall. This told him that the fever had broken enough for her to move around without collapsing. "You need to clean the cuts before you walk anywhere," he said. She glanced at the basin on the table, then at her legs. The silence that followed held an unspoken question. Would he help her, or would he leave her to do it alone? Wade filled the basin with warm water and placed it at the foot of the bed. "Sit," he said simply. She lowered herself onto the edge of the bed, her muscles tense and her expression unreadable, but alert. He crouched down and lifted one of her feet into the water. She stiffened. He gripped her ankle only as much as was necessary, and after a moment, she didn't pull away. He washed the dried blood and dirt from the cuts in silence. When she flinched, he slowed down, but didn't stop. To him, this wasn't charity. It was practical. Out here, infection killed faster than bullets sometimes. Once he had finished cleaning both feet, he wrapped them in strips of cloth and tied them tightly. She stayed quiet throughout the process, only speaking when he moved the basin away. "Have you fixed men before?" Her tone conveyed curiosity rather than disbelief. He wiped his hands on the towel. "I patched up trail crews when fights or raids hit us. It didn't always work." His voice hardened slightly at the memory, but he didn't dwell on it. She stared at him for a moment, then asked a question that took him by surprise. "Did your brother die there?" He didn't know how she had guessed, but perhaps something in his eyes had given it away earlier. Wade didn't answer for several seconds. Finally he said, "Yes, Salt Creek Ridge. Wrong place, wrong time." That was all he could manage. She processed the answer without apology or pity. She just nodded as if she had filed it away. He stood up and moved to the table. "You can sit outside if you want some air, but stay close to the cabin. If the riders see you out in the open, they'll assume you're alone or have been captured again." She didn't argue. She pulled herself up, wrapped the blanket around her waist like a skirt, and stepped slowly towards the door. She walked with a limp, testing each step. The bandages cushioned her weight enough. He followed a few paces behind in case she fell, but she made it onto the small porch, unaided. Outside, the sun was pale and not yet hot. The soil was dry, but not cracked in the shade. She lowered herself onto the edge of the porch, the blanket still covering her legs. Her hair moved slightly in the breeze, and he noticed for the first time how long it was, hanging down past her ribs and looking thick and tangled. She scanned the horizon with trained eyes, not just out of curiosity. "No smoke," she said. "No riders either," he replied. He checked the ridge again anyway. She looked at the corral, the shed, the stacked wood, and the fenced patch of earth where he used to grow beans before the drought ruined the last harvest. "You live far from others," she said, speaking deliberately. He nodded. She seemed to expect that. After a long pause, she spoke again. "I won't go back to town. If the soldiers see me, they'll either take me or kill me. If the writers see me, they'll sell me." He crossed his arms and leaned against the porch post. "I didn't plan to send you to town." She absorbed that without comment. He could tell she was about to ask another question from the way she looked past him. He waited. "You'll give me the horse when I leave?" she asked, her voice steady. "I've got one left, that sound. But I won't let a horse loose with someone who can't ride yet, or without knowing where they're going." She looked down at her hands, then lifted her chin. "I don't run. I'll either find my people, if any of them are still alive, or I'll follow the trail of the men who took me." Wade didn't show it, but something in that answer made his jaw tighten. "You? I know their faces." She nodded once, her eyes darkening. 3. I remember them. This told him something he hadn't been sure of. She didn't just want to escape. If she tried to track them on foot, she might come back in pieces. He wasn't about to tell her that, though. He stepped off the porch and walked to the well. While he was drawing water, she called quietly from behind him. "Why do those men know your name?" He paused, rope in hand. He hadn't considered that when he first saw them. He turned around slowly. "You heard them say it." She narrowed her eyes. "One said Carrick Land. They know this place." Wade set the bucket down. "I've worked with some of their kind before. I've driven cattle, carried messages, and fought off bandits. They hear names? They spread them when it suits them." She considered that. They came back. They got what they came for. But if they talk about it in town, someone might find out you're here and cause trouble. She didn't look frightened. She looked calculating. "Then I must stand up before I go. If they come, I won't hide under the blanket." He didn't argue. He just said, "You won't be alone if someone shows up." She watched him for a few more seconds, reading between the lines. "You speak truth now," she said, not as a compliment, but to acknowledge the difference between empty promises and genuine intent. Inside, he cleared the dishes away and put a spare blanket near the stove. After an hour outside, her feet sore and her body tired, she returned to the cot. Before she lay down, she did something that neither of them had addressed directly. She dragged the cot so that its head was closer to the wall, rather than facing the door. It was the act of someone who had been taken while sleeping before. He pretended not to notice, but he understood. While she rested, he rechecked his rifle, made sure the chamber was clean, and put it within reach, but out of sight of the door. By nightfall, the land was still quiet. Now, however, there were more reasons than silence to keep watch. By the next morning, Ayana was able to stand unaided. She moved slowly, testing her balance. The bandages held tight enough to prevent her feet from splitting open again. She didn't ask for help, and he didn't hover. The silence between them had settled into something that wasn't hostile or awkward, just straightforward. While he cooked cornmeal and reheated beans, she used the comb he had left on the table to work through her hair. The strands were knotted and streaked with dried blood, but she persevered, wincing only when a tangle caught too tightly. She tied part of her hair at the back with a strip of cloth from the ruined dress. The rest fell over her shoulders. The shirt he had given her hung loose but stayed closed. When he handed her a tin plate of food, she didn't thank him verbally, but took it without hesitation. She ate every bite cleanly, leaving no scraps. After swallowing the last spoonful of beans, she wiped her mouth on her sleeve and put the plate down gently. There were still questions Wade hadn't voiced. Had anyone from her group escaped capture? Would the army circle back near Salt Creek? Might the men who had traded her brag about what they had done? He pondered these thoughts while pouring himself a coffee. Ayanna spoke first. "Do you know the names of the men who took me?" Wade leaned against the counter and thought back. He had seen their faces clearly. There was one with a scar across his eyebrow, one wearing a cavalry coat, and one with whiskey breath who had led the rope. "The one who talks the most is named Strick McCall," he said. "He's worked as a gun for hire, cattle thief, and freight escort. I've seen the others near town, but I don't trust any of their names." She listened without blinking. "Do they say where they're going?" "No," said Wade. "But they were short on feed and carrying no packs. They'd stop in Broken Mesa or at the trading post south of the ridge. They want to sell that horse, if they haven't already." Mentioning Broken Mesa caused her expression to harden slightly. Men from the town buy women like me. Wade didn't deny it. He'd seen worse deals than those involving horses. She asked something unexpected. "If I say their names, will you tell me if I'm saying them right?" He understood. She wanted the words to be clear in English, so that there would be no mistaking who she meant to hunt. He nodded once, then said, "Say what you remember." She spoke slowly, piecing together sounds. McCall, Hennon, Rig, or Rick. One call, the other Sloan or Stone. She paused, then added, "They speak about a man with a blue coat at the army fort." That triggered something he'd pushed aside. If they were dealing with someone at Fort Haven, then any harm done to her might be tied to more than just drunken thugs. He studied her face. "You sure they said that?" She nodded once. "They talked like they'd trained me before and then traded me again." This detail answered one of the questions he had been considering. She hadn't been captured during the raid and sold immediately. They'd been moving her around, probably to find a buyer. If a soldier was involved, handing her off could cause more problems than a simple rescue would solve. After she had finished speaking, he took the plates to wash them. Ayanna stood up and walked slowly to the doorway. She braced a hand on the doorframe and stepped outside. She stood on the porch and looked out at the flats. The air was clearer than the day before. There were no dust trails and no riders crossing the ridge. Like someone trained to read the land, she scanned the horizon, narrowing her eyes where the trail bent out of sight. After a minute, Wade joined her. He brought a piece of jerky and a water pouch, offering them to her without explaining why. She took both. "I track men when my feet are strong," she said, "but I can't walk far alone yet." He nodded. He knew the look in her eyes, someone storing up strength for a purpose. The question circling in both their minds finally surfaced. "If your people come before the soldiers," said Wade, "do you want them to take you, or do you want to wait and see?" She didn't look at him when she answered. "If my father is alive, he will find me. If he's dead, my uncle or cousin will come. They'll see you and think you used me." He didn't flinch. "Then I will stand with you when they arrive." She turned her head slightly at that. She wasn't surprised or grateful. She was just measuring to see if he meant it. "Why do you do that?" He didn't sugarcoat it. "Because you're under my roof, and because you didn't choose to be left here." She looked away again, but there was a hint of relaxation in her shoulders. Not trust, but acceptance. A silence passed before another unspoken question found voice. "What if the army comes first?" she asked. "I'll tell them I found you tied up and almost dead," he replied. "If they want to drag you off, they'll have to get past me first." She processed that, understanding exactly what he meant. He wasn't offering to die for her, but he also wasn't handing her over. They stayed outside until the sun rose higher and warmed the dry ground. She practiced stepping off the porch and back up again to test her legs. The bandages were already dusty, but still held. Wade went to the shed to fetch a smaller water barrel. While he worked, Ayanna spoke in a quiet voice. "Do you think they came back for the horse? Or for me?" "Not for you," he replied. "They didn't know your name. They didn't know who you were to anyone. But if they brag in town, someone else might follow." That answer put an end to one more question. Before going back inside, she asked the one thing he had been waiting to hear. "When I'm strong, if I stay longer, will you make me leave? Or let me decide?" He looked at her directly. "You walk out when you're ready. No one is forcing you here or away." She held his gaze for a moment longer, then nodded once and stepped inside. By nightfall, neither of them had said it aloud, but the truth had settled in. Whatever came next, tribe, soldiers, or the men who had brought her, they would not face it as strangers. By the next day, the air held a dry stillness that usually meant the temperature would rise quickly. WDE stepped out early to check the fence lines, but his focus kept drifting back towards the cabin. Ayana had slept through most of the night without a fever, and the way she moved that morning showed that she had regained some strength, although pain still accompanied each step. When he returned inside, she was sitting at the table instead of on the bed, wearing his shirt tied at the waist with a strip of her old dress. She had washed part of her hair in the basin and plaited it into 2 thick plaits that fell over her chest. The boots he had given her were on her feet, laced as tightly as she could manage. The bandages were still visible at her ankles. She looked at him, then at the rifle leaning by the door. "Are you staying or riding today?" she asked. "Stay," he replied. There was too much risk in leaving this place empty. She nodded slowly. "I'll walk a little way, not far, just outside." He didn't stop her. He watched how carefully she put her weight on each foot before taking a step. She walked to the porch, stood at the edge and breathed in the morning air. The sun hadn't heated the ground yet, but the light was bright. He brought 2 tin cups and placed one next to her. She took a drink and remained silent until she had swallowed. Then she asked, "Do you think the army riders will pass here again soon? Maybe tomorrow?" "It could be 3 days. They don't travel regularly unless there's a chase," he answered. Ayana's eyes moved across the horizon. "If they come and see me, they'll ask questions. If they see that I'm wearing your shirt, they'll ask more questions." Wade leaned his shoulder against the doorframe. "Then you stay in till they pass. They don't search homes unless they're called to." She considered that. Then, without warning, she asked the question she hadn't yet asked. "You tell someone in town that I'm here?" "No," he said. "I don't speak to the townspeople unless I have to. The last time was near spring." She accepted his answer without suspicion. But another question followed. "What would you do if the men who took me come back? Would you let them take me again, or would you fight?" He didn't look away when he answered. "I won't let anyone drag someone off my land and treat them like an animal. If they come back, they won't get away easily." She heard the finality in his tone. She didn't question it further. They stayed outside for a while. She walked from the porch to the water trough and back again several times to test the distance. He fetched a clean cloth and handed it to her without saying a word. When sweat started to gather on her forehead, she wiped her face and returned the cloth. After a while, she sat on the edge of the porch steps and asked a question that had not been asked until now. "You say your name is Wade, but does anyone else here know you? No wife, no family?" He hesitated, then told her the truth in pieces. "My brother used to ride with me. He's buried east of here under a mosquito marker. He had no wife or children, and no one else came to visit him." She looked in the direction of the grave, though she couldn't see it. "You still speak to him?" He gave a dry laugh that wasn't quite a laugh. She didn't press further. She looked down at her bandaged wrists. After an extended silence, she said, "The men who took me think I am nothing. They call me a slave. They say I have no people left." "But they are wrong." Wade listened. Her voice trembled not at all. It was filled with certainty. "My father is Tana," she continued, "chief of the Blackwood band. If he's alive, he'll send trackers. If he's dead, his blood will still make them come." This explained why Apache riders might appear without warning. Wade absorbed this information without showing any outward shock. He only asked, "Are you sure he's still alive?" She nodded once. "I didn't see his body. I didn't hear him take his last breath. Until then, he's alive." Wade respected the firmness with which she said it. His own brother had died in his arms. There was no uncertainty there. "If my people come and find me here with no rope or chains, they will listen. If they see a sign, they'll know I'm being used." She didn't finish the sentence, but he knew what she meant. If they thought he had taken her as if she were property, there would be bloodshed first and questions afterwards. He answered in a low voice, "No one here touches you or claims you. If they write in, I'll be the one speaking. They can either listen or try to kill me, but they'll know that you weren't wrongly detained." Her eyes held his longer than before. They were steady, not soft. The afternoon heat was bearing down by then. She went back inside to rest her feet and rewrap the bandages. WDE fetched fresh water from the well and brought it in. This time, she washed her hands and face properly without him needing to tell her. He checked the rifle again, then shut the door partially to keep out the dust. While she rested, he sat at the table and sharpened his knife. The sound of steel being sharpened filled the quiet. Before she fell asleep, she said something quietly but clearly. "If my people come, you don't run." He put the knife down. "No, I won't run." She seemed to weigh up the significance of his answer. Then she lay back with one arm across her stomach and closed her eyes without fear. By sundown, neither of them had spoken again, but both knew something that hadn't yet been said. Whatever came next, it wouldn't create distance between them, whether it was her people, the army, or the men who had sold her. No part of this was separate anymore. Before dawn, the wind shifted, carrying a faint trace of horses that didn't belong to Wade. He woke instantly, not from the sound, but from a habit formed over years of living where trouble came without warning. The air was colder than the night before. There was a bite to it that didn't match the season. He sat up, reached for the revolver by the bed, and listened. Ayana was already awake. She was sitting on the edge of the bed with her blanket pushed aside and her boots on. She hadn't spoken, but her posture showed that she had heard the same thing as him. She looked at the door, then at him. There was no panic or surprise in her expression, just readiness. He stood up, holstered the revolver, and moved quietly to the window. The land outside was grey-blue in the early light of day. He scanned the ridge leading from the canyon trail. 3 dark shapes moved slowly along the rise. They weren't close yet, but they were closing the distance. He recognized the way they rode. They rode straight-backed and silent, not weaving like drunks or scouts pretending not to look. These were warriors, not wanderers. He looked back at Ayana. There were 3 riders, not an army, and not the men who brought her. She stood up carefully, testing her legs. The fever had gone, and her strength was steadier. She tightened the strip of cloth that held his shirt together at her waist, then moved to the window and looked out without leaning. Her breathing became deeper, but still controlled. She didn't blink when she said it. "My people?" She studied their distance. "You sure?" She nodded once. The raven marking on the horsetail was the only sign of the Blackwood band. He hadn't noticed it at that range, but he trusted that she knew. He'd been expecting the question ever since she'd spoken her father's name. Would they take her? Or would they cut him down for touching what belonged to their blood? He stepped back from the window. "You stay inside until I've spoken to them." She turned to him sharply. "If they see only you, they'll think you're hiding me or using me. I'll stand by the door, but not behind you." He considered this. She was right. If they thought he had kept her chained up or imprisoned, they wouldn't ask twice. "Then you speak first," he said. "Name your father. Make them see that you are not a prisoner." She didn't waste time agreeing. She simply moved towards the door and waited. Wade stepped onto the porch with his rifle lowered, not aimed. He didn't shout. He stood where they could see him clearly. The 3 riders slowed when they spotted him. As they came closer, the horse in front revealed the marking Ayana had mentioned. 3 slashes carved into a small piece of bone braided into its tail. The lead rider was older with lines at the corners of his eyes, and his hair was braided with small beads and feathers. The other 2 were younger. One had a scar near his temple, and they both carried bows and rifles across their backs. They stopped 30 yards from the cabin and watched him with hard, unreadable faces. None of them reached for their weapons, but none of them relaxed either. Wade didn't move. He spoke in a flat, steady tone. "She's alive. She's inside. She wasn't taken by me." Before they could answer, Ayana appeared in the doorway. She didn't walk towards them, but stood where they could see her fully. The younger rider stiffened, their posture showing shock, even if their face didn't. The older rider's eyes narrowed. Relief and fury were evident in his expression. Ayana raised her chin slightly. "I am not bound. I stand by my own will." The older man spoke in Apache first, his voice low and intense. She answered in the same language, in short phrases, and with a controlled tone. Wade didn't understand the words, but he could hear the man's voice accusing her and disputing her words. Then she switched to English, probably so that Wade could understand. "He cut the rope. He gave her food. No soldier has touched me since. One of the younger riders glared at Wade as if that weren't enough to wipe suspicion clean. The older one dismounted slowly, his eyes fixed on Wade. He spoke English carefully. "You trade horses for her." Wade shook his head once. "They left her tied up. I let them take the horse to avoid spilling blood in my yard. I didn't buy her. I didn't keep her." The man's jaw moved as he processed this information. He looked at Ayanna again. "You hurt?" She answered in a whisper. He nodded once and shifted his gaze back to Wade. "Why did you help?" Wade didn't beat about the bush. "She would have died if I hadn't. I've buried enough people in this area." His words weren't intended to convince them, but they did. The man studied his face for a moment, then spoke to Ayanna again. Her reply was shorter and calmer this time. The older writer looked at Wade once more. "She's Tanya's daughter." Wade already knew, but he didn't react. "Then it's right, you came for her." Ayanna stepped forward a pace. "I'm not leaving yet," she said to her tribesmen. This took all three by surprise. The younger ones frowned. The older man spoke sharply in Apache, demanding an explanation. She answered in a low tone, glancing briefly at Wade, but not stepping behind him. Wade stayed silent. He wouldn't interfere in that decision. After a tense exchange, the older man finally nodded once, though his stiff shoulders showed his reluctance. He turned to Wade. "She is not a prisoner, you speak the truth, but the men who took her are going somewhere." Wade indicated the direction of the broken mess hall in the trading post. There were 3 of them, one with a scar over his eyebrow, one in a cavalry coat, and one who called himself. The older rider memorized the details with his eyes. He spoke to the younger men in Apache, then mounted his horse again. They would hunt now, and whatever debt they believed Wade owed them might depend on the outcome. Before they turned to leave, Ayanna said one last thing in her language. The older man looked at her, then weighed up the situation again. He gave a curt nod towards the cabin. It was neither friendly nor threatening. Then the 3 riders turned their horses and disappeared the way they had come, as silently as they had appeared. When they were gone, Ayanna let out a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. Wade lowered his rifle but didn't put it down yet. She looked at him, neither fearful nor shaken, just certain of what her people understood. "Now they'll come back soon," she said, "but not to kill you." He didn't ask if she planned to leave with them next time. He only asked, "Do you trust that?" She held his gaze. "I stand with you. They can see that. They know I have chosen of my own free will." It was a question that neither of them had voiced yet. As the sun climbed higher over the ridge, the implications of that choice hung in the quiet. The Apache riders didn't return that day, but their absence changed the atmosphere around the cabin. Wade checked the rifle only once after they left, then leaned it back in its usual place. Ayanna stayed near the doorway for a while, not out of fear, but because she was thinking through what might come next. She sat at the table and ate the beans he had reheated without being asked twice. She was strong enough again that her hands were steady, and the bruises on her wrists were dark, but no longer raw. The cuts on her feet were healing under the bandages. She didn't limp unless she misstepped. Wade sat across from her. Neither of them spoke until she had finished eating, but the silence wasn't uncomfortable. It was the same kind of quiet that had settled in since the first night, a quiet that said more than words without forcing anything. When she set the tin plate aside, she looked directly at him. "They won't take me unless I ask." He nodded once. "I figured that from the way you spoke to them." She studied his face for a long second. "You think I'll leave now?" "That's for you to decide," he said. "You're not tied to this place, but if you walk out, I won't stop you or follow you." She seemed to weigh his words carefully. "You said you wouldn't run if they came. You'd stand your ground. Is that true?" "I don't break my promises," he replied. She accepted that. Then she said something he hadn't expected. "They know you won't harm me. They'll tell my father. He'll send word when he hears I'm alive." He didn't answer immediately. His eyes stayed on hers, waiting for what she wasn't saying. When she finally spoke again, her voice was steady. "If I go back to the camp, they will ask me to stay with them. They say I must return to the women's lodge. But I'm not the same person I was before." He understood what she meant. Whatever had happened before she arrived here, it had changed what it would feel like to wait among her own people. She wouldn't be seen in the same way. "You can stay here until you're sure," he said. "Not as a prisoner, just until you know what you want." She leaned back slightly, thinking. "If soldiers come first, "I'll speak before the rifles are raised," and he said, "And if the men who took you come back, they won't leave upright." She seemed satisfied with that, but she still looked at him carefully. "If my father comes himself and asks you why you're keeping me, then I'll tell him the truth." Wade said, "I didn't keep you. You stayed." Her expression didn't soften, but something in her eyes settled. She stood up slowly and walked towards the door. He followed her out onto the porch. The land stretched out in all directions, the ridge casting a long shadow over the plains. The tracks of the Apache riders were still visible in the dirt where the sun hadn't baked them away yet. She looked at them, then past them, then back at Wade. "They'll come back when they find the men," she said. "They'll bring proof." "You think they'll kill those men?" Wade asked. She didn't hesitate. "If they find them before the soldiers do," she replied. "Yes." He didn't argue with that. Justice wasn't the same everywhere. She stepped off the porch and walked a short distance towards the dry trough and back again. Her movements were steady now. There was no stagger in her step. When she stopped near him again, she said, "I'll stay until I see my father or receive word from my people. Even if they tell me to go, I still choose." He didn't hide the question in his voice. "Choose what?" She looked him straight in the eyes. "To stay or to leave. Not to be taken either way." Boom. He held her gaze. "Then this place is yours, same as mine, until that choice comes." She didn't thank him or smile. She just nodded once and went back inside. As the afternoon passed, Wade repaired the door hinge and fetched more water. Ayana cleaned the cot, folded the blanket and tidied away her things, as if claiming the space as her own. When he didn't ask her anything about it, she glanced at him once to check if he would object. He didn't. That night, she didn't sleep on the cot. Instead, she laid her blanket on the floor near the wall opposite his bed, closer than before, but still not beside him. He didn't comment or ask why. Before she lay down, she said one more thing. "When my people come again, I will speak first. They will hear me," he replied, "and I'll be here when they do." The final light faded behind the ridge. Outside, the wind was calm, and there was no sound of hooves or threat. Inside, two people who had met by force and accident now shared a space, not out of fear, but by choice. Nothing was left unfinished. No one was waiting to claim her. No one waited to drive him off. Whatever came next, Apache kin, soldiers or silence, would meet them on the ground. Neither stood alone. The story of Wade Carrick and Ayana, the chief's daughter who was mistaken for a slave, teaches us the importance of having the courage to defy assumptions and the strength that can be found in choosing compassion over isolation. Wade, a solitary cowboy scarred by loss, could have turned away from Ayana when she was tied and broken in order to avoid the trouble that her presence promised to bring. Instead, he cut her ropes, offered her shelter, and stood by her even when her identity as Tina's daughter brought with it the threat of her tribe's wrath. His actions teach us that true honor lies in protecting someone's dignity, even at the risk of our own safety. Ayana's refusal to be defined by her captor's cruelty and her decision to remain until she could determine her own path demonstrate the resilience of an unbroken spirit. Their bond, forged through mutual respect, reminds us that trust can flourish even in the harshest of circumstances when we engage with others honestly. This tale stirs deep emotions and urges us to reflect on the moments when we can stand up for those whom society has dismissed, offering them not just survival, but also the chance to reclaim their voice. It challenges us to open not just our hearts, but also our doors to those in need, trusting that shared strength can redefine what home means. Please share your thoughts in the comments. What does this story inspire in you? Have you ever stood up for someone against the odds? Like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell to join our community and receive more soul-igniting stories that remind us of the power of human connection. Your support helps to keep these timeless tales alive.